Welcome back to Heritage and Hope Ministries. Today we are very excited to be talking about the book Stop in the Name of God by Charlie Kirk. I'm joined by Brian, Dr. Brian Hustad. I'm also joined by James, as always, and I'm also joined by Scotty from Little Light Studios. Scotty, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this book, Stop in the Name of God, is really interesting because this is a chart topper, isn't it?
It's quite a hot button topic at the moment.
Yeah. So this was actually on the #1 bestseller for Amazon.
You know, I think we had a little bit of a personal connection here to Charlie Kirk as well. For those of you who watch the channel, back in January of this year, we had the chance to be there at Trump's inauguration. Not that we were supporters of one side or the other politically, but while we were there in the freezing cold, and you can check our other video about our experience there, we actually did run into Charlie Kirk. He was actually walked down the line of people who were passing out books and got one of those books, The Great Controversy, and I saw him personally put it in his coat jacket pocket. That was an interesting opportunity to kind of see the man face to face, and we only hope that perhaps in reading that book, The Great Controversy, that it might have had an impact on his studies about the Sabbath.
Yeah, no, when you say that we have a personal connection there, it's not that we have a political connection where we agree with everything that he said.
Exactly.
And we have to make that very clear because people are immediately going to think that we're diehard Charlie Kirk fans and agree with all of his policy. So that is not the case. However, he did talk about the Sabbath a good deal, and obviously he wrote a book on it.
Yeah.
And so we, as Seventh-day Adventists who are ensconced in history and understand the seventh day and what it means for the rest of society as we go forward, we should have an understanding of what is being talked about in popular culture. I mean, this book is popular enough that the President of the United States was promoting this book on his Truth Social page, saying that this was a good thing and, to go to his website, to Donald Trump's website, to go and purchase a copy of it. So he's selling it on his own website. When was the last time that we had a United States sitting president promoting a book about a day of worship?
We're at this moment.
Yeah.
I think we're coming to this moment. And I think that no matter what side of the fence you sit on this topic, it's a great opportunity because it's on the table.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's beautiful that we can all now talk about it, and hopefully we should be talking about it.
Yes.
Because it's getting discussed right now on a national level.
And I think that we're seeing prophecy fulfilled in front of our very eyes.
Yeah.
And we're watching it unfold on social media posts. We're seeing it on the news. We're seeing it on Amazon bestsellers. And what are we doing as Adventists to awaken, to warn the world of the coming calamity that is going to come? Because we do believe that there is going to be a spiritual test over the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Well, to answer that question, I think in some ways, there were some Adventists that actually tried to give that message, and they connected with Charlie Kirk. So for those of you who don't know, there was the Wisdom Pearl events where some of the Adventists, actually some people in our ranks actually sat down and discussed the Sabbath with Charlie Kirk, which I think in reading the book, it obviously had an impact upon him. I don't think that in reading the book, I don't think by any stretch he understood everything about the Sabbath. We're not suggesting that this book is full of nothing but truth. There's a lot of truth and a lot of error, honestly, mixed in it as well. But it does give me a lot of hope that, maybe we can reach some of these people by sitting down and having respectful dialogues with them, as Charlie Kirk did in some cases with others. It's nice that it had an impact upon him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes also, even if there is varying views of the Sabbath or what he was meaning to be the Sabbath or what they're taking the Sabbath to mean or all those things, I think they really give us an opportunity to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that lay the information out on the table. I mean, that's what everybody needs to hear right now, right? Is like the arguments presented on the table, and certainly there's an opportunity here to really discuss, like, hey, if there is some things that we can say, hey, yeah, that's what we actually believe on the Sabbath, or if there's some things that are not, we can say, you know what, this is actually what we really find that the Bible says about this, and.
Mm-hmm.
I have had some friends of mine, because I've discussed it a little bit publicly, socially on social media and whatnot, who have questioned, well, why, if there's error in this, I don't need to read that book. I don't need to be aware of it. And there's a quote actually from 5 Testimonies that says that God's means that testing truth shall be brought to the front and become a subject of examination and discussion, even if it is through the contempt placed upon it. The minds of the people must be agitated. Every controversy, every reproach, every slander will be God's means of provoking inquiry and awakening minds that would slumber. So what I take away from that quote is that even if the book were to cast contempt upon God's true Sabbath, which, there are some obvious points in error within it, but even if it was straight out contempt, it can still be used for the sake of the truth to awaken minds to inquire, well, is this really true? Is this really accurate? And so in that sense, I think we can use it to that benefit.
Yeah.
So number one, this actual copy of it was very hard for me to get. I had it ordered on Amazon, and Amazon had no shipping date. So I went down to Barnes & Noble, and Barnes & Noble was sold out when I got there. They had sold completely out. So then I had to drive about 30 or 40 minutes to go up to Books A Million, and they had a few copies of it left. And I was able to get one there. I think that they have probably sold out by now because everybody was trying to get a copy. And now if you look on Amazon, you can't even, it's sold out. So it's an incredibly popular book. Now, a lot of the stuff that is said here, we would actually probably agree with. So for example, here in the introduction, it says, "In my life, I hold the Bible as the ultimate authority, drawing from its wisdom to guide my thoughts and actions." Do we believe that?
I'd agree with that.
Absolutely. We would agree with that. It says here, the Bible is not merely a collection of ancient writings. It is the most authenticated piece of literature in history. I would agree with that.
I would agree with that.
It says here, its history with its vivid portrayal of past events and its prophecies about the future has shaped the foundation of Western civilization. Indeed, it is the Bible that has built the West, and it is the Bible that will ultimately guide and restore it. What do we think about that?
It sounds very postmillennial.
Yes, it does.
Post-mill.
I think the picture that we have is in the Bible is worse and worse and worse. But it seems that they're placing this idea that it's like, we're going to turn this thing around and have this like sort of golden age come back.
So what did you, we just threw a term out there, post-mill. Okay, and we said that sounds very post-mill. Let's unpack that for those who are watching who don't understand what post-mill means.
Okay, so they, as I understand it, they kind of believe in ushering in, I think, a millennial age where the church kind of reigns and ushers in the time of Christ, if you will, and that Christ comes at the end of the millennium. His actual return comes at the end of this 1,000-year reign of peace on earth.
That's how they take Matthew 28 as this great commission to go disciple all the nations. And not just, it's not the people within the nations that turn them towards God. It's actually making the governments Christian of those nations. It's setting up Christ's kingdom on earth.
You see a lot of the musicians that have that kingdom now philosophy. That's kind of what they're putting in there, is that we're going to build this kingdom here and now, and it's going to happen right now.
Yes. Yep.
So he says here, even in a world that often turns away from faith, the echoes of biblical wisdom are woven into the very fabric of our legal system and moral compass. As civilization faces growing challenges, it is not merely political or philosophical ideologies that will save us, but a return to the timeless truths found in the Bible. Its message offers a pathway to renewal, not only for individuals, but for entire societies, calling us back to a moral order that can heal the divisions of our age and restore meaning to a world desperately in need of it. Yeah, probably agree with him on just about everything he's saying there. But as we go forward, there's a lot that I found myself agreeing with, but then things started to creep in my mind that I was like,
where's it going?
This is a little bit of a twist. Yes.
What's it stacking up to?
Just briefly, one point I wanted to make, in watching Charlie Kirk up to this point, before he's even addressed the Sabbath, I saw him debating a lot of current issues in pop culture. For example, the LGBTQ, gay marriage, abortion, different things like that. I actually was just watching one recently on abortion where he was talking about, when is a child actually a human being? Like all the way back at conception. And what I found was sad with this book is while he's able to recognize a human being all the way back at the very beginning at conception, he's not able to recognize in this book very clearly that the Sabbath today, the true Sabbath, is the one at creation on the seventh day.
All the way back to the conception of the world.
Yeah, all the way back. And speaking of, there's two institutions the devil has attacked: the Sabbath and marriage. And we see that with, some of the ways in which marriage has been defaced in our modern culture. And while there are many Christians today that recognize that, talk about, transgender issues or other stuff that's going on today, what about a trans Sabbath? Like in the sense where the original Sabbath as God intended it, the seventh day of creation, has now been abomination.
It's like you can be Sabbath fluid. It doesn't matter. Just pick a day.
Exactly.
Is what you're
Sabbath
saying.
fluid instead of gender fluid, a Sabbath fluid.
Right.
Exactly. So that's not something that he really grasped in this book.
But, he does equate the Sabbath, and I want to be very careful with how we use the term Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
When he's talking about Sabbath, he's not talking about a specific day.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's talking about a day of rest.
Right.
He's not meaning which day.
Right. And I think I heard or saw a video clip of Erica reading an excerpt in here on what that rest day meant, like sleep all day, like do whatever it is you want to do. You want to watch football, you want to do this. And I think there's something that's like when you read the Bible as a whole and you sort of see how God has worked with humanity over this day of the Sabbath. It's like you can see very clearly that it was not a day of picking our own pleasures.
No.
And doing whatever it is that we wanted to do, as long as we weren't engaging in anything else. It was like, in fact, isn't there examples of God causing a punishment towards the people for doing the pleasures on their own Sabbath and defiling them?
Well, it says, if you will refrain from doing thy pleasure on my holy day.
Exactly. It was a day that God was setting aside to spend with us, that we should be doing not anything else we would do at any of the other days to reflect on him. And, I think there's a clear distinction between just doing whatever you want and just choosing one day to not do.
Well, I think it goes all the way back, to Genesis, where he blessed and sanctified the day. So it's a memorial to him as the creator, but also our sanctifier.
That's right.
Because he's very specific about how we're supposed to rest on the Sabbath day, and that no stranger within our gates, nor our manservant, our maidservant, no one is supposed to do any work. It's because it's pointing to him as the sanctifier, and only Christ can do that work.
Yeah, and you think about if you're doing whatever you want on whatever day, right? There's still people that have to work and serve and do whatever they're doing. So how does that fit into that model?
Right. And with Charlie Kirk specifically, it's not controversial to say this because it's public. Like you said, he was an avid Oregon Ducks fan and would watch football on the Sabbath. It was more about the way he talked about it, putting his phone away in a drawer and disconnecting from his business and kind of doing his pleasure. And then actually, from what I understand, he went to church on Sunday.
Interesting.
One of the things he says here, because James, he does actually equate it all the way back to Genesis, but he doesn't carry forward and say that it's still on the seventh day. He says it really doesn't matter later on in the book. But here, the first chapter is titled Genesis 1:1. And so he says the Sabbath is the oldest continuous spiritual celebration in human history. Most people, even those raised in religious traditions, do not fully grasp this, and I will emphasize it throughout this book. The Sabbath is not primarily a legal command. It is a cosmic declaration. It is a weekly embodied confession that we are created, not accidental, that there is a creator, and he is not us. So he says here, the Sabbath is not primarily a legal command.
Well, to answer that, what I would say is, does it matter if you worship a Christ or the Christ? Because at the end of the day, and people may dismiss, that's a cheap shot. But what about Ezekiel 20, verse 12, where God equates the Sabbath as connects it to who sanctifies us with the name, the Lord your God. So there's this connection to the name of God. But further, when he goes later on into different texts within the book about, how the day might have changed through the actions of the apostles and alleged, some of those texts which we can go through. If I go back to Genesis and what happened, going back through, for example, the story of, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was blessed by his father, and then when Esau comes along and wants to get this blessing, the father cannot change the blessing to him. He doesn't have the ability to change what he's already blessed.
Well, I am the Lord, I change not.
Exactly. So how can the apostles then go change what God has blessed?
Yeah.
When Esau's father couldn't do that in his day.
And if you've ever heard people say, well, I pick whatever day this is, and I treat every day like the Sabbath. Well, do you work? Because part of that commandment is also that 6 days shalt thou labor and they'll do all their work, right? That's a commandment. Like sometimes people don't think of that as a commandment, but it is actually commandment to work those 6 days. So are you breaking every Sabbath then if you're working on whatever day you want to, or you're taking a Sabbath but you're also working?
Yeah. In Exodus 31, it's even more clear on this. It says in verse 14, "You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, the soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but the seventh is Sabbath of the rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death." But in verse 13, that's where I'm going to start. It says, "Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you."
Well, so going forward in this first chapter, he actually starts mixing terms. So he starts mixing Sabbath and Sunday. So he says, even in our modern democratic societies, the Sabbath has not been abolished by decree, but slowly eroded by culture. The rise of 24/7 consumer economies, digital technologies, and work from anywhere expectations has blurred the boundaries of time. Sunday has become a day for errands, sports, emails, and binge watching, another cog in the machine of productivity. Wait a second. We're here in Genesis. The title of the chapter is Genesis 1:1, and all of a sudden, wait a second.
Yeah, everybody else has done this, so yeah, we're cool.
Suddenly, Sunday's crept in here. Wait a second. There's nothing here that validates that.
To me, it doesn't make any sense. Why would he use the word syncretic when he talks about the history of the Sabbath and how it began to change and some of the influence of Constantine and paganism that crept into the church? Why would you use the word syncretic? I mean, that does suggest that this crept in through an amalgamation of Christianity with paganism.
Can we take that same concept that you just read right there and apply that to any of the other 9? I mean, let's just think about this, right? So I'm gonna say that maybe marriage has changed over the years, and what we all define as marriage is completely changed, right?
He would disagree with you.
Okay.
Charlie Kirk would disagree with you then.
So then, but we don't do that to that. We don't say that just because culture has treated it like that all of a sudden that it's totally fine. You don't say like all of a sudden, well, you know how many cartoons you've watched where the dad's like the moron, right? And so all of a sudden it's like we don't as kids really need to honor our parents. Why? Because culture has really like slammed on this, right?
He would disagree with that too.
Now I can change that.
Yeah.
None of those, you can't all of a sudden use God's name in vain, even though yes, culture does all the time, right? I don't think that. I think it's a very interesting thing that they all of a sudden take this one day and it has this just like, oh, that doesn't matter to that day.
Yep.
So what you're saying is his entire argument to the abortionists about, well, you know, how old the baby really is, for example, that somehow, you know, they would use that argument that if enough time has passed, then it's okay. He's actually kind of implying that here, that enough time has passed, that it's okay to make this change, like enough tradition throughout the years has been defined like this in the Christian world that now it's okay to honor it on Sunday. I mean, that's the impression I get.
That's the impression that I get, but I'm just saying that you don't do that with anything else.
Right.
You know, the thing is he has statements here where he says the 10 Commandments were not merely religious edicts. They were moral declarations that applied to everyone, everywhere, because they came from a universal God. A.W. Tozer, in The Knowledge of the Holy, wrote, "The decline of the knowledge of the holy has brought on our troubles. When the concept of God is lost, the sense of moral obligation is also lost. Monotheism, sound morality to ontology. What is right is not what the strongest God demands, but what reflects the unchanging character of the one true God." And I'm like, so he's saying they apply to everyone, everywhere, which I would agree with.
Mm-hmm.
So there's many statements in here, especially in the first 2 chapters, that I'd have to agree with him on. You know, he talks about, one of the large sections is chapter 2. Nothing doesn't create something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole notion of this chapter is talking about the rejection of the Big Bang, the rejection of evolution. He goes forward and talks about nothing doesn't come from, or something doesn't come from nothing. And he goes through all these posits about it. He talks about the origin of the universe. He talks about the premise of causality, the premise of the universe began to exist, the premise of a cause beyond nature. He talks about fine-tuning the universe, a case for God. Talks about the digital code in DNA. He brings up the analogy of a hurricane assembling a Boeing 787 and says, obviously that doesn't work. If you had a monkey type on a typewriter and randomly hit characters, eventually you'd get Shakespeare's, characters. He talks about letters spilling into Shakespeare, a coin flip of the universe. So he talks about all of this and says, let there be light. Genesis 1 verse 3. This is the birth of distinction, the first incision of order into disorder, light separated from darkness, structure from shapelessness, meaning from madness. And this act is not incidental, it is theological. God's nature is revealed in what he does. He separates, he orders, he names, he blesses, and he fills. I'd agree with him.
Yeah.
This is good stuff, but as you go forward, chapter 3 is talking about the history of the Sabbath.
Yeah, this is where it starts to get a little sketchy.
Because as he starts going forward here, one of the things he says here is the Sabbath is a sanctified protest against the tyranny of constant motion. As philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel reflected, the Sabbaths are our great cathedrals, the Jewish equivalent of sacred architecture. Rather than building monuments of space, the people of God were called to consecrate time. And in doing so, they declared that God, not Pharaoh, not Caesar, not Mammon, governs the hours. Okay, that's good. He talks about the Sabbath before Sinai, a primeval benediction. And then he goes on and he says, the significance of the Sabbath's place in the Decalogue cannot be overstated. It is the longest commandment, the hinge between duties to God and duties to neighbor. And unlike the prohibitions against murder, theft, and adultery, it is ceremonial in nature. Wait a second.
Yeah, he's not understanding the distinction between ceremonial Sabbaths in Leviticus 23 and the moral Sabbath.
No. It says, it alone among the 10 regulates the use of time. That it would be enshrined alongside laws of moral preeminence suggests something staggering, that the sanctification of time is not ancillary to moral life, but essential to it. Okay, that's interesting. But as you go forward, he says here, he walks all the way down to our time, going through the history of the Sabbath in brevity. He says, later in the Hellenistic period, the Sabbath emerged as a flashpoint of resistance. Under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Jewish practices including circumcision, Torah study, and Sabbath observance were banned. Many chose death over desecration. The Maccabean martyrs were among those who refused to fight or flee on the Sabbath, demonstrating an almost unimaginable fidelity to divine rest. Do you think that those same martyrs would have had a problem if someone came along and said, oh, you can do it, just do it on Sunday? I think many of them would.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of jumping forward, throughout the Middle Ages, Sunday observance was woven into the fabric of Christian life.
Yeah, so this part of the book right here is one where I found that, he starts to introduce some of the discussion about Sunday legislation. And he even goes later on into the time of the Reformation to kind of talk about some of the reformers who spoke about Sunday as well and kind of rejecting, kind of which day it actually needed to be. And his choice was interesting. I saw he mentioned Martin Luther, for example, and some of the other reformers and theologians. But what was missing from that history is the context that it was very much debated back and forth in the Reformation between Sabbath and Sunday. And he paints this picture as though what came out of the Reformation was, well, it doesn't really matter which day that you do it, but that doesn't really paint the entire picture of there were many individuals at that time who firmly held that it does matter which day, and there were those who died and who gave their lives once again, who refused to compromise on the matter and refused to syncretize with Rome. And, he goes through some of these individuals. I saw a lot of references in that history section there to Sunday being like, the eighth day of creation, kind of the Epistle of Barnabas, for example. Yeah, it goes back to Gnosticism where, you have this eighth heaven or this eighth day on which you receive peace after you commit fornication. And kind of pushes all of that, which is ironic because, that was heresy that crept in. It was not something that was legitimate in changing God's law at all. So I find his history section there really missing huge aspects of Sabbath history when he's talking about some of that.
Well, he also brings in some of these statements without really much proof. He says, "Yet the resurrection inaugurated a new order. On the first day of the week, the tomb was empty. The early church began gathering on that day to break bread and worship." Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 2-3. By the end of the first century, Sunday had emerged as the Lord's Day. Revelation 1, verse 10.
Oh, right.
So boom, boom, boom. He gives 3 verses there talking about them breaking bread. How would you quickly, in maybe one sentence, kind of refute what he says there, James? Acts 20, verse 7.
Acts 20, verse 7 can be quickly answered by Acts 2, verse 46, where they broke bread daily. And also Paul, because the days are measured even to even, they're actually breaking bread at night. You can see this with Eutychus falling out of the
Window.
Yeah, the window. So the very next day, Sunday morning, Paul's out catching a ship to Assos. He's not resting on the day. He's not resting on Sunday at all. He's actually working. And furthermore, if you're breaking bread 7 days a week, what does breaking bread on Sunday prove about changing a divine commandment that Christ already said himself in Matthew 5, verse 17 through 18, would not change by jot or tittle?
Well, he also says, Revelation 1, verse 10, on the Lord's Day.
Yeah, so that's already defined elsewhere in Mark 2, verse 27 through 28 as the seventh-day Sabbath. And 1 Corinthians 16, it was actually common with the Jews to actually set aside something even on a Sunday for the seventh day of the week as a preparation for the seventh-day Sabbath themselves.
So he goes on to say, church fathers such as Ignatius of Antioch exhorted believers to no longer live according to the Sabbath, but to live in accordance with the Lord's day. Justin Martyr, writing in the mid-second century, describes Christian worship on Sunday as a remembrance of both creation and resurrection. Tertullian and Origen viewed the Sabbath typologically as pointing toward eternal rest in Christ. What are your thoughts on Ignatius of Antioch?
Just because somebody kept it or said it was this way doesn't necessarily mean that it's not scripture.
No.
That guy could have been way off base.
I thought the whole point of the book was to go back and appeal to Scripture and returning to biblical purity, right?
That's right. That's right.
So why are we now mixing in church
Find the line.
fathers?
Yeah.
It always falls back on tradition.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some guy changed that somewhere along the line, so therefore it's now this.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an appeal to tradition. If you want to see a full breakdown of all of the history of the Sabbath, we have a very long video on our channel that goes century by century and actually breaks down all the different church fathers throughout history and what their thoughts were on the Sabbath.
And I want to say this, because maybe there's some people that are stumbling across this video and watching this being like, whatever, these guys are totally off base, right? Just go through the history. Honestly, just go through the history. If this confronts, like a very, stark, you've grown up and you've thought it this the way the whole time, just if you go through it, you can see that line of truth that will be traced.
So then he says, Sunday became the new day of sacred assembly, though not immediately a day of rest. It was 321 Common Era decree of Emperor Constantine I that transferred Sunday into a civil day of rest. On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. This edict, though partially syncretic, set the legal precedent for the sanctification of Sunday across Christendom.
There it is.
Interesting.
There it is, syncretic. Okay.
Yeah. And, for all the talk of those different texts that he brought up about Sunday, fading away or something, or Sabbath fading away into Sunday, for all those texts, one of the things that struck me is later on in Revelation, he comments on Revelation 14:12, stating, in the final book of Scripture, God's people are identified as those who hold 2 defining marks. They trust in Jesus, they keep God's commandments. These are not 2 different camps, but one people, faithful to both covenant and Christ. The Sabbath commandment's the longest, most detailed of the 10, and only one that explicitly identifies God as creator. It makes sense, then, that in an apocalyptic age defined by spiritual deception and false worship, the Sabbath would reemerge as a sign of fidelity. How is he not making the connection here between the Sabbath being the sign and then Sunday being the mark of the beast? Like, it's so clear when you study out the scripture texts which define what God's sign is. why can't we make the logical conclusions as to what the Bible identifies as false worship?
So he goes on, though, he says, throughout the Middle Ages, Sunday observance was woven into the fabric of Christian life. Canon law prohibited servile labor. Mass attendance was obligatory. Feasting and rest were encouraged, while theological justifications varied. The rhythm of 6 days of labor and 1 day of sacred rest remained. So he's painting this kind of genial picture of the Middle Ages, which were the Dark Ages. And then you have the next paragraph. Listen to this. The Protestant Reformation complicated the picture. Luther emphasized Christian freedom and downplayed Sabbatarian rigor. Calvin upheld the moral obligation of weekly worship but rejected legalistic constraints. So he's like, you Protestants, which he was a Protestant, right?
Right. But once again, just the way that somebody reacted to it isn't necessarily the truth of that thing.
Yeah, right. So he continues to go on talking about the Sabbath throughout history, going down and how we've basically forgotten it. But he talks about blue laws. We get to the United States in the 1700s and going forward from there, and he says, at the same time, Sunday blue laws in the United States proliferated. These laws banned Sunday commerce, alcohol sales, public entertainments, and in some places even fishing, sports, or hanging laundry. They were designed not merely to enforce piety, but to carve out protected time for the soul, the family, and the church. For decades, these statutes enjoyed broad support across denominational and even political lines. Yet, in the increasingly pluralistic and commercial 20th century, they began to face legal and cultural resistance. Jewish and Catholic minorities often protested the Protestant basis of the Sunday laws, especially when it required business closure on both Saturday for the Sabbath and Sunday, effectively harming their livelihood. So he goes on talking about blue laws here for several pages, actually. And in general, the overall sentiment of his discussion on blue laws is in a positive light. Basically, that this was good for society, that this helped maintain people's morality. What would we say to that?
I think that we do live in a society that is nonstop, and we don't take the proper time for family. But once again, I think that God is very invitational.
Yeah.
And I think that once you start forcing this line here, then you're going to have a whole bunch of people that are doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. And Joshua here, choose this day whom you will serve.
That's right.
And then I stand at the door and knock. God is a God of free will.
That's right. The power of choice goes out the window.
Exactly.
One of the things that he's highlighting here is the degradation of society and how far we've fallen. And we've seen recently news about physician-assisted suicide actually now coming back in one state, another state in the United States, which I know is disturbing to a lot of people and, of course, to us as well. But there was a study that came out recently that churches were keeping Americans alive. Then states made one fatal decision, and it was a research at Wellesley College where they were looking at when pews emptied out in the 90s, death rates exploded. The connection to blue laws is clear. They're trying to make a connection here that blue laws actually decrease death rates from suicide, drug poisoning, and liver disease by about 2 per 100,000 people. So when he's commenting about the degradation of society and kind of the way things used to be and referencing blue laws, he's not alone. There are many other people that are referencing this, and even Erica Kirk, subsequent to all of this, has been discussing blue laws. So we can see that dialogue like starting to come around. And what's particularly concerning to me is that Turning Point USA has their America Fest going on right now, and she's talking about an initiative this next year, Make Heaven Crowded, of going out to like, I don't know, something like 8,000 churches or some massive amount of people to take kind of their views, it sounds like, nationwide. Are they going to be taking and promoting blue laws as a means of, hey, this is how we bring society back and solve all of these moral problems that are creeping into the United States? We just need to bring back blue laws.
He finishes off the history of the Sabbath here by basically saying, let the world race on, but as for me and my house, we will stop. And this is after talking about blue laws in particular. And so I think that he was in general kind of favoring legislating something to do with the Sabbath. But he doesn't actually explicitly state that. I'm just saying the overall tone was positive towards blue laws. Chapter 4, and kind of going forward for a few chapters here, he talks about stuff in general that a lot of it I would probably agree with. He talks about, what do you worship? He talks about there's a lot of self-worship. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on. Some of it is political talking points. I'm not here to try and condone everything that he had to say on those topics at all. But a lot of it, he's talking about worship of self. He's talking about science stuff and power, the age of counterfeit worship, the cult of scientism. He talks about the recent pandemic that we had and talks about Anthony Fauci and goes on talking about some of the details there. So he goes forward from here. Chapter 6 is really interesting. This is where it talks about Seventh-day Adventists. Mm-hmm. So he talks about the Sabbath improves your health. And he actually speaks very positively about Seventh-day Adventists. He says, I recently spoke at an event on a Friday afternoon held by Seventh-day Adventists in Phoenix, Arizona. They had me come speak about the Sabbath as they were preparing for an all-day worship Sabbath among their congregation. Despite some core theological differences, I was struck by their joint commitment to unplugging from the modern world. And then he goes forward from there and talks about the blue zones and how Adventists live longer than the rest of the population. He goes forward from there and talks about depression and says that they did a study basically where they analyzed rates of depression among Seventh-day Adventists and found that we are wildly happier than the rest of society.
Interesting.
And so he kind of talks about that. And I would have to agree with him that the Sabbath is transformative. It really does help our lives if we rest and we heal and we embrace God rather than embracing the rat race that is all around us. So he talks about the Sabbath improves your sleep. He talks about sleep and weight gain, sleep and mental health, what happens during sleep, the caffeine trap. He talks about the half-life of caffeine. Caffeine is not a performance enhancer. It's a loan shark. It robs from tomorrow to pay for today. That's how he ends that section. I'm like, wow, he's actually right there. So a lot of this, if you were reading this, it's true. There's a lot of truth in here.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you kind of skip forward and listen to what he says. Are Christians bound to the Sabbath? This is an interesting chapter. He says, as someone who now observes a Saturday Sabbath, I want to be clear. I don't think the specific day, Saturday or Sunday, is of primary importance.
No, I think this is really an interesting thing that you're going to observe, because they're like now saying, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. But wait, what happens when it gets to the place where now it will be bound?
Yeah.
Now, how are you going to change that? Because I do believe that they will inch closer and closer to this time that they're saying, no, you need to observe this day. And if you don't, there's consequences of that. So it doesn't matter until we get to that point.
Yeah, and that's not a like an invalid concern. You know, there's actually an American broadcaster and a conspiracy theorist from One American News, Emerald Robinson, on Twitter. She's actually, once again, kind of, you know, fringe, if we can say that. But nevertheless, what are some of these people saying? And she had a tweet recently, December 13th. My fellow Christians, watch out for Operation Shabbat Shalom. That's the push to encourage you to stop going to church on Sunday and switch to the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday. This is heresy. And then she quotes, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day, specifically from the Council of Laodicea. So we can already see people who are chomping at the bit to say, hey, you should not work, or you should not rest on the Sabbath day. You should rest on the Lord's day. You should work on the Sabbath. In other words, profane what God sanctified. And so it's, you know, it's not hard to see that if the book is calling for a rhythm, and like a national rhythm, or a sabbatical rhythm, is everybody like beating the same drum? If you got some people over here that are saying, nope, we're going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, but they're calling for the first.
In the beginning, I'm sure it's going to be just pick a day.
Yeah.
And then it's going to be like, well, that's not really going to be productive in the long run, so let's just like force this one day.
Yeah, during this chapter of Are Christians Bound to the Sabbath, he says, but then I think of the church fathers. Not all were in agreement. But some voices, like Ignatius of Antioch, began shifting Christian worship to Sunday very early on. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century also noted that Christians gathered on Sunday because it was the day Jesus rose. This is the seed of what would later grow into institutionalized Lord's Day. Yet it's also clear that early Jewish believers continued Sabbath observance, sometimes alongside Sunday gatherings. There was tension then too, and it wasn't easily solved. So he has 2 chapters kind of back to back. The first chapter is, Are Christians Bound to the Sabbath? And he basically goes through and proves or tries to prove that, yes, they were, we're still bound to keep the Sabbath. And he talks about Luke 4, verse 16, as was his custom, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Isaiah 66, from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares the Lord. And then he even brings up Hebrews chapter 4. He says, So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. The Greek word used here, sabbatismos, is rare and precise. It does not mean generic rest, but Sabbath observance. This passage is part of a broader theological argument that connects God's rest in creation with the believer's spiritual rest in Christ. But the conclusion is striking. The Sabbath is not gone. It remains. So he quotes that, but he fails to quote the first verses in Hebrews chapter 4 that define that as the 7th day. So he's only picking the later verse that says, there therefore remaineth the Sabbath of rest. And he doesn't refer to the beginning of that chapter. So then after he talks about the Christians being bound to the Sabbath, he says, as I have stated previously and repeatedly throughout the book, the Sabbath is the most ignored commandment by modern Christians to our own detriment. Some bodies of theology reject all the prior claims and believe that the Sabbath is null and void and that we no longer need to make the 7th day holy. Here is my best attempt after years of thinking and research to articulate that school of thought. So basically, he's trying to show both sides of the coin. And this is when he makes the case and says, that there's Christians out there that believe that, Christ is my Sabbath. And he says that the Galatians warn against returning to calendar observance. Galatians 4, verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid I may have labored over you in vain.
It doesn't really help his case because, isn't he advocating to observe a time?
Oh, he is, yeah. And the thing is days, months,
case?
seasons, and years is not referencing the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Because the 10 Commandments only had one time law. That's it.
Yeah.
And all the rest were part of the ceremonial law, which was kept in the side of the ark, not written in tables of stone with God's own finger.
Yeah.
It's also the only commandment that starts with remember. That we might forget.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It might want to, we've talked about this before, but it might be worth talking as well about how the Sabbath is actually the seal of God.
Yeah.
And so, James, what constitutes a seal?
Well, Jeremiah 22, verse 24. As I live, saith the Lord, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet upon my right hand, yet would I pluck thee thence. So here we see a signet, or which would carry a seal or a stamp. And there's 3 elements here: a name, title, and territory. God's name is referenced with the 7th-day Sabbath. And what's interesting is in Ezekiel 20, verse 12, we see that. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. And
sanctify means set aside for some special holy purpose.
Yes.
Well, and remember, it's the name of the Lord. But what do we see in Revelation 14, verse 1? A lamb stood on Mount Zion with him 144,000, having his father's name written on their foreheads. Guys, take a look at the front of the cover of his book right here.
Yeah, interesting.
Well, what is he holding out there?
His hand.
His hand. What I find interesting about that is, doesn't Revelation 14 speak about a mark that is upon the forehead or upon the hand?
Yeah.
And, speaking about God's commandments, in Exodus 13, verse 9, we
That was deep what you just said right there.
Yep.
I'm just like soaking that in for a second. I think that might have gone over like a lot of people's heads if they didn't stop. But I'd never thought of that before looking at that.
Yeah, his hand, it's actually right there.
Yeah.
But think about this for a second. We'll get back to that hand in just a moment. Exodus 13:9 says, it shall be a sign unto thee upon thine hand,
Wow.
or for a memorial between thine eyes, okay? that the Lord's law may be thy mouth, for with a strong hand hath the Lord brought thee out of Egypt. But in Ezekiel 9, which is kind of a counterpoint to Revelation 14, there is a life-saving sign or life-saving mark upon the people's foreheads in the midst of men that sigh and cry that saves them from the destroying angel. So you have a true mark or true seal upon your forehead, and there's a false mark in Revelation 14. And it's just the imagery right here with this.
Wow.
It's apocalyptic.
It's
It
wild.
is. Yeah, I didn't catch that.
It's very much apocalyptic.
You're right. So if we were to go back to Exodus 20, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord, his name,
Yes.
right? And then he made his
Yeah.
office or position as the creator, and then his territory is the heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them.
Wow.
Yep.
So that's why this matters.
Yeah.
This is why this is under attack
Yeah.
so viciously.
Yeah. But it's like you see it coming about in this way. It's kind of like we've talked about this, but we haven't really talked about how this is going to get presented to everyone.
Right.
And that the fact that this is the number one
Yeah.
book right now that's on discussion.
Yeah.
Because the argument would be like, why does it matter? It's just a day, which I would throw right back at
Yeah.
the Sunday keeper. But
Yeah.
it matters because it's an attack on Christ.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of people that started going to church because of Charlie,
Mhm.
to a Sunday keeping church. Okay. What's interesting is think about it. All of the talking points against the true Sabbath, he's highlighting in this book.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, for example, he says here, Acts 20, verse 7, on the first day of the week, when they were gathered together to break bread. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside. The early church began to gather on Sunday, not to replace the Sabbath, but to celebrate the resurrection. Over time, this became the normative rhythm for worship and community. He's literally giving them talking points for how to combat the true Sabbath. So how does the devil work? He mixes truth with error. I'm not saying everything in this book is wrong. There's a lot of the stuff that's like on health and sleep and all that other stuff that's really good.
Right.
But you mix in just a little bit. You know, if I gave you a smoothie and I was like, oh, don't worry, it only has 1 drop of cyanide in it.
Yeah.
You would not want to drink it, right?
No, I would not.
I do see where he speaks about Revelation 14:12 as the Sabbath returning as like the sign.
Yeah.
It did seem to impact him, at least the seriousness of it, perhaps a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you can talk about Revelation 14:12. It's so clear. It says, here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Well, what are the commandments of God? It's clearly his moral law.
Yeah.
So how can you even quote that and not understand the truth of the Sabbath? I mean, it's right there.
And what does that mean to, like, Jesus fulfilled it, so therefore we don't have to? Like apply that to a different one, right? So
Yeah.
Jesus didn't murder, so I don't have to not murder.
Yeah.
Right? So now all of a sudden I can?
Right.
Or like, what are you actually saying by that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They don't have a problem with the other 9. It's just
Yeah.
that one.
This final section of these 2 chapters that are kind of comparing and contrasting that, yes, we do, and then no, we don't. He kind of finishes, he says, so, are we bound by the Sabbath? That's the bolded, highlighted portion. And he says here, the Sabbath is God ordained. It was blessed and sanctified at creation, written in stone at Sinai, honored by Christ during his earthly ministry, and whether in principle or practice, respected by the early church. At its core, the Sabbath is a standing celebration of the world's beginning, a weekly reminder that creation has meaning, that rest is holy, and that we are not slaves to labor, our devices, or our ambitions. Whether you believe it is legally binding or not, it remains a divinely instituted rhythm, and to ignore it entirely is to disregard something God declared good. I'd have to agree with all of that. So the last chapters of the book here is basically, so now it's your turn, and he talks about how to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath made simple. Create a Sabbath start ritual. Turn off your phone for 24 hours. Plan screen-free meals with friends and family. Curate a Sabbath basket or shelf. Take a slow walk in nature. Write a gratitude list at the end of the day. Try a Sabbath soundtrack. Say no to 1 non-essential task each Sabbath. Read 1 psalm every Sabbath. I mean, all of this is good stuff.
But here's the problem. In his conclusion, he says, now imagine if America began to honor the Sabbath again, not merely as a personal spiritual practice, but as a national cultural rhythm. Picture Saturday or Sunday once again becoming a time of collective pause. The problem is that the reality has been throughout history, and this was even consistent with the Reformation, that in the Augsburg Confession, Article 28, the most hotly debated topic was the contention between Saturday and Sunday. And so you may successfully get a law that prohibits commerce on one day of the week, maybe Sunday, or maybe with an exception clause to Saturday. But what's going to happen when you start having those people who believe in keeping God's commandments telling the other ones, hey, you're doing heresy. You're doing something that in violation of God's law. Can two walk together except they be agreed?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no union between error and truth. At the very end, Christ said that he came not to bring peace, but division, and that division separates truth and error. So it's not going to work long term. As much as he'd like to say picture Saturday or Sundays, they're not going to walk peacefully.
I think it's like Scotty said earlier, it's kind of the poison pill that'll be, we'll give you a waiver and everybody can kind of have their own day and then slowly, and that's what happened in the leading up to the Senator Blair in the 1800s as well.
We've actually talked about the Sabbath quite a bit over on your channel, Little Light Studios, and there's a number of different videos that are on there that we've actually had the privilege of coming and doing, talking about the coming National Sunday Law and talking about some of the proofs for that, some of the video clips that are out there. And also, did the Sabbath really change from Saturday to Sunday? We have a video about that over there. So I would encourage everybody to go and check out Little Light Studios and watch some of those videos, and also subscribe to Little Light Studios so that people can stay up to date on the goings on there. When I think about the Sabbath, when we have the truth, we need to be taking it more seriously ourselves. We need to be, it's interesting to hear somebody who's not a Seventh-day Adventist talking about all the ways and all the joys they have of keeping the Sabbath. He didn't have all the truth, but he's talking about some stuff here that is good. Shouldn't we be doing the same? Shouldn't we be a witness to all of our friends and family about how we keep the Sabbath? Maybe we should have a specific Sabbath start time and little way we do things each time to make it special. A special meal that's prepared ahead of time, making sure that the car is filled up with gas, making sure that the clothes are set out to go to church, making sure that we have ways to decrease our mental burden on the Sabbath. I think that those parts of this book are really good, actually. But we know that there's going to be coming a calamity that is going to engulf this world, and we have a message to give. It's a line in the sand distinction between good versus evil, between God's way versus Satan's way, the supplanter. There's a power that was talked of that would think to change times and laws, and that has happened prophetically. We knew it was going to happen. We've seen it happen, and now our job is to tell people that it has happened.
Time to be vocal.
The test in the garden was simple. It was, you shall not eat of this fruit. It's the same with this specific day.
You mean we can't eat from both trees?
Right, exactly.
Well, you bring up a good point. Most of the other 10 commandments, everybody's going to agree with, right? I mean, everybody knows you should not have another God, shouldn't kill, should honor your mother and father. The only one that's really like, do you listen to God or not? Where we failed was listening to God.
Right.
And so it makes sense that it would come full circle all the way back around, and we're crossing back over that. Do we do it just because God said to do it?
Yeah,
exactly.
Or are we listening to what man is telling us?
Yes.
Well, guys, thank you very much for joining us for this very special episode on Stop in the Name of God by Charlie Kirk. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel so you don't miss out on coming videos, because we've got a lot of exciting updates for this coming year. We've got a lot of exciting videos coming.